Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me out there? Great. My name is Shinryu, and special welcome to those of you who are newer to Village Zendo who I don't know. We will have a little get together after the talk for those who are newer to Village Zendo, if you'd like to chat afterwards. And thank you, Ryugen. At the start of our zazen, Ryugen encouraged us to enjoy our zazen. And I wonder, did you enjoy your zazen? What is it to enjoy zazen? So I've found myself the past few days thinking about a writer who's an old favorite of mine, the Turkish poet Nazim Hikmet. And Hikmet was a political prisoner in Turkey for around 12 years. And he wrote some remarkable poetry when he was incarcerated about what it's like to be imprisoned, about life and death. And I think what always inspired me about Hikmet is that in spite of the conditions in which he was living, his spirit, in a way, was never crushed. And it, in a way, went beyond the four walls in which he was being confined. So I think the reason I was thinking of Hikmet is because we have all been confined for the past couple of years. We've been restricted in various ways, enclosed, isolated, sometimes pretty solitary fashion, in a sense, incarcerated too. And so, you know, the pandemic has led to, for many of us, maybe not for all of us, but all sorts of feelings of frustration and anxiety and oppression, really. And of course, there are many other things going on that can contribute to that feeling. I've been also, in the past few days, following a new wildfire out in California, the Palo Colorado Canyon fire, which is near where I grew up on the central coast of California. And it's amazing to me because I have no recollection of fires around Palo Colorado Canyon when I was growing up. It's a pretty wooded area. It's right along the coast, which is foggy much of the time. And this is January. How can there be a wildfire in January on the coast of Central California? And so when I think about California now, it's, for me, these associations of being hemmed in by the threat of fire, or in having to inhale smoke wherever you are, and other situations too. The sense of political, the oppressive sense when we think about political forces that are anathema to us, that are on the rise, or the oppressive sense that young people today are less and less likely to be able to match the level of material welfare that their parents had, with increasing class differentiation in the country, the oppressiveness of racial discrimination and violence, and so forth. So it's really easy to get up in the morning and pick up the paper and start reading the headlines and then feel that the onset of that frustration and anxiety and oppressiveness. So so this is our time of the month when we reflect on the precepts. And the question that I'm thinking about tonight is, how does our practice help us with the sense that we may have of being unfree in our lives today? And the precepts that I wanted to look at to think about this are the three pure precepts of ceasing from evil, doing good, and doing good for others. So I think that when we think about the precepts, we think about doing evil. What we're talking about really is, what are those things that cause harm to ourselves and others? And we can think about the harm that comes from killing, from stealing, from abusing power, lying, intoxicating the mind, criticizing others' errors and faults, putting others down and elevating ourselves, being greedy, indulging in anger, or demeaning the three treasures of Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. But if you think about those different kinds of actions and speech that cause harm, there's a way in which ultimately they go back to really our thoughts and our mental outlooks, which are at the root of our greed and our anger and our confusion. And I think that perhaps one of the key sources for all of the suffering is really just our sense that we are separate from others and from the world around us, that we're separate, we have different interests, and therefore that leads to tension and conflict and potentially violence with others, either individually or societally. So that sense of being separate it's our egotism, really, and it has to do with a view of ourselves and our world which is very, very narrow. We see just a small piece of the big picture. And I think our study text, the Shotoka, has a great image for this. At the end of the text, do you remember that line? Don't belittle the sky by looking at it through a pipe. But I think that's really what we do. We see reality, we close one eye, right? And then we look through one eye and through this pipe, and we see just this small patch of the sky. And then we tend to focus on those things that we find threatening to ourselves, right? And produce this sense of existential anxiety and oppression. It's a unhealthy, kind of a morbid tendency to keep focusing on those things that we find threatening to ourselves and really missing the full range of experience and of reality. So I thought I'd share with you a little bit of Nazim Hikmet, where he talks about that sense of oppression, first of all. This is from a poem called Letters from a Man in Solitary. It's the first part of the poem. He says, I carved your name on my watch band with my fingernail. Where I am, you know, there's neither a pearl-handled jackknife, they don't give us anything sharp, nor a sycamore with its head in the clouds. Maybe there's a tree in the yard, but to see the sky overhead is forbidden for me. How many people besides me are in this place? I don't know. I'm alone, far from them. They're all together, far from me. To talk to anyone other than myself is forbidden. So I talk to myself, but I find my conversations so boring, my dear wife, that I sing songs. And what do you know, that awful, always off-key voice of mine touches me so that my heart breaks. And just like, and then he goes on, it doesn't make me blush that my heart right now is this weak, this selfish, this human, simply. There's probably a physiological, psychological, etc. explanation for my state. Or maybe it's this barred window, this earthen jug, these four walls, which for months have kept me from hearing another human voice. It's 5 o'clock, my dear, outside with its dryness, its eerie whispering, its mud roof, and with its lame, skinny horse that stands motionless in the midst of infinity. I mean, it's enough to drive the man inside crazy with grief. And Hikmet points to the biggest problem of all, which is not actually to be confined. He says, this is a poem called 26 September 1945. He says, they've taken us prisoner. They've thrown us in jail, me inside the walls, you outside. But this is nothing. The worst thing is for a person, knowingly or not, to carry prison inside himself. So how can we work with this kind of oppression? I think that the first precept of ceasing from evil is really about putting aside the pipe, that narrow view of things, just putting it aside. So the Zen Peacemaker Order, when it worked out its interpretation for this precept, came up with the phrase not knowing, and thereby giving up fixed ideas about myself and others. Those fixed ideas that can be so narrowing and can be in a way so unhealthy and morbid for us when we're constantly going back to things that we perceive as so threatening to ourselves. And another person I've been thinking about the past few days is the great Vietnamese Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh, who recently died, and who I was seeing on someone's screen. I think it was Lumi's screen earlier this evening. And Thich Nhat Hanh came up with a set of 14 precepts for his disciples as part of his order of interbeing or interdependency. And I thought I'd share with you the first 3 of his precepts, because I think that they are very close to the Zen Peacemaker Order's notion of ceasing from evil. The first precept goes, do not be idolatrous about or bound to any doctrine, theory, or ideology, even Buddhist ones. Buddhist systems of thought are guiding means. They are not absolute truth. And the second precept is, do not think the knowledge you presently possess is changeless, absolute truth. Avoid being narrow-minded and bound to present views. Learn and practice non-attachment from views in order to be open to receive others' viewpoints. Truth is found in life and not merely in conceptual knowledge. Be ready to learn throughout your entire life and to observe reality in yourself and in the world at all times. And then the third precept is, do not force others, including children, to adopt your views. Do not force them by any means whatsoever, whether authority, threat, money, propaganda, or even education. However, through compassionate dialogue, help others renounce fanaticism and narrowness. So I think you can hear throughout this the same idea of putting aside the pipe, just not knowing, letting go of attachment to ideas. And to the narrowness, he refers a couple of times again to the narrowness. And Nazim Hikmet in prison actually had an experience of what I think is was not knowing, and he wrote about it in the following way. He said, this comes at the end of the same poem, Letters from a Man in Solitary, where he starts out talking about the kind of grief that he feels. And then he says, Sunday today. Today they took me out in the sun for the first time. And I stood very still, struck for the first time in my life by how far away the sky is, how blue and how wide. Then I respectfully sat down on the earth. I put my back against the wall. For a moment, no trap to fall into. For a moment, no struggle, no freedom, no wife. Just earth, sun, and me. I am happy. So it's like an expression of beginner's mind. For the first time, I'm stepping outside. For the first time, I'm seeing the sky in all of its breadth. And then it's as if he's doing his own zazen. He sits down on the earth with his back against the wall. And then it's right out of the Heart Sutra. No trap, no struggle, no freedom, no wife. He's writing to his wife, actually. But he's just there in that moment, feeling the sun, feeling the earth, and enjoying it. If we're able to do that, to put aside the pipe, to let go of our fixed ideas for a moment, then we can see reality in its plenitude, and we can see what's right in front of us. And that's a way to think about the second pure precept of doing good. So the Zen Peacemaker order for the second pure precept came up with the phrase, bearing witness to the joys and suffering of the world. And again, I think it resonates with the way Thich Nhat Hanh talks about, he said, be ready to learn throughout your entire life and to observe reality in yourself and in the world at all times, bearing witness to the joys and suffering of the world. And it's interesting that when the Zen Peacemaker order was discussing these, how to frame these tenets, I know our own Enkyo Roshi was a part of those conversations. And I've read some of her notes from the conversations they were having. And at one point, Bernie Glassman, who was leading the process, said, with bearing witness, I'm trying to find a language to talk about zazen. And there were people in the meetings who said, I actually don't like this language of bearing witness. It sounds to me really dualistic, like there's a witness and then there's something being witnessed. There's a subject and an object. But Bernie's position is that that's not what this is about at all. It's not an observation based on separation. It's an awareness of non-separation. It's an awareness of our interdependency. And it's really based on deep empathy. So maybe take a minute here and think about how these things are, what they mean in our own life. I mean, what is not knowing in your own experience, or what is bearing witness in your own experience? And it might sound like a lofty idea, but it's really not such a foreign thing at all. We have very direct and intimate experience of that. Just the zazen that we were doing before the talk started gives us an experience of this. So when we're sitting and then suddenly we become aware that we are being carried away in our thoughts, and in that moment we just come back to the present, that's really not knowing. Letting go of the thoughts is not knowing. And then we come back to just what is going on right now in our bodies, with our breath, with our feelings, with our thoughts. And we bear witness, and to our surroundings, and we bear witness. So it's something that's actually available to all of us. So I think Nazim Hikmet also captured this beautifully in his poetry. So share with you first of all, a few lines from a poem called Some Advice to Those Who Will Serve Time in Prison. He said, part of you may live alone inside, like a stone at the bottom of a well. But the other part must be so caught up in the flurry of the world that you shiver there inside when outside at 40 days distance, a leaf moves. And one other poem is called 12 December 1945. The trees on the plain are making one last effort to shine. Spangled gold, copper, bronze, and wood. The feet of the oxen sink softly into the damp earth, and the mountains are dipped in smoke, lead gray, soaking wet. That's it. Fall must be finally over today. Wild geese just shot by. They're probably headed for Isnik Lake. In the air, a coolness. In the air, something like the smell of soot. The smell of snow is in the air. To be outside now, to ride a horse at full gallop towards the mountains. You'll say, you don't know how to ride a horse, but don't joke and don't be jealous. I've acquired a new habit in prison. I love nature, if not as much, nearly as much as I love you, and both of you are far away. So he's so attuned to the moment in this poem. Fall is ending today, and the geese are just flying by. And it's full of this sensory perception of the soot in the air, in the smell. The coolness of the air. And he's attuned to the colors of the changing colors of the trees, to the feet of the oxen in the mud. Awareness and no real separation, I think. And so if we're able to do this, to put the pipe aside and see reality as it is right in front of us, we're able to respond more naturally, more freely to what needs to be done in the moment. And that's a way we can think about the third pure precept of doing good for others. So what would be examples of this? Roshi gave a recent talk on Dr. Martin Luther King. And Roshi often talks about service in the world, right? And says, when we really know ourselves, naturally we serve the world because we know there's no separation. And she talked about how Martin Luther King's service was so aligned with the Buddhist conception of interdependency, right? The inescapable web of mutuality, single garment of destiny. And thinking about Thich Nhat Hanh, I was also reading a little bit about his relationship to Martin Luther King during his anti-war activism in the 1960s. And I didn't know this, but Thich Nhat Hanh had written to Martin Luther King even before he came to the US, and they shared the stage together. He'd written to him encouraging King to come out against the Vietnam War, which King had not done up until that point. And I think it was not until 1967 that King came out publicly against the war. And he did so in his Riverside Church speech uptown. And in the speech, if you read it, there's a point where he says, he cites the words of what he calls some of the leading Buddhist teachers of the day. And he doesn't name him, if the words he cites are the words of Thich Nhat Hanh. Thich Nhat Hanh had come from Vietnam to the US, and it was a courageous thing to do because he, in speaking out against the war in this country, he angered a lot of people in this country. He angered the South Vietnamese government, and he also ultimately was seen as an enemy by the new communist government that emerged in Vietnam. So as a result of his anti-war activism, Thich Nhat Hanh was essentially exiled from Vietnam for close to 40 years. And exile is another form of imprisonment in a sense. And there was one story that particularly struck me in that tricycle piece that someone in the Sangha sent around. I think he was in Boston and at an anti-war event. And at some point during the event, a guy got up in the crowd and began haranguing Thich Nhat Hanh and saying, who does this guy think he is, this compassionate bodhisattva? When the bombs are raining down on his people in Vietnam, he's traipsing around the United States when he should be at the side of his people who are dying and being maimed. And it stirred up this really intense feeling in the public at the event. And everyone was waiting for Thich Nhat Hanh to respond, and he was quiet. And he waited for a few moments before he spoke. And then he finally said, you can't cultivate a tree by pouring water on the leaves. You have to pour water on the roots. And the roots of the war in Vietnam are here in the United States. And that's why I'm here. And with that, the atmosphere in the whole room just completely shifted, and the whole mood just really settled down. And the author of this piece, who was accompanying Thich Nhat Hanh at the time, noticed that he turned to the moderator of the event and whispered to him, and then he walked out of the room. So the author went after him, and he found him outside, and he was hunched over, and he was breathing in this really labored way. And the guy said to him, are you sick? What's the matter? And Thich Nhat Hanh explained that the man's anger, the anger of the man in the crowd had triggered his own anger so much that he had to do this really intense breathing exercise to breathe really, really slowly to be able to respond in the moment. But now he was just feeling the emotion and the recovering from the slow breathing and sort of pulling himself together. And the author asked a really good question. He said, if you were so angry, why didn't you just express your anger? And Thich Nhat Hanh said, I couldn't do that, he said, because I'm here representing the Vietnamese peasantry. So awareness of interdependency. I think there is a bit of a risk in celebrating people like Martin Luther King and Thich Nhat Hanh. These are people who had major roles to play in a key historical moment. We look up to them, we admire them, they inspire us. But we have to be a little bit careful about setting people up on a pedestal and then imagining that doing good for others has to be some heroic performance or some sacrificial martyr-like kind of behavior. That's not Shinryu Roshi's teaching. That's not Thich Nhat Hanh's teaching or Martin Luther King's teachings or the Buddha's teachings. We can do good for others in a very natural way, in a more unself-conscious and leisurely way, if you will. And that's just by letting go of our fixed ideas, seeing what's right in front of us and stepping up and doing what's called for. After we read the newspapers and feel all of the alarm bells going off, then we get out and make a cup of coffee for our partner, or get on email and write a message to a friend who's sick, or start to work with our colleagues in a Zoom call, or go out and teach our classes, or get involved in our communities to do what we can do to respond to conditions. So we have resources to be able to live the three pure precepts. We have our zazen practice to let go of fixed ideas and bear witness and see what's right in front of us. We have the precepts and the teachings of Shinryu Roshi and Thich Nhat Hanh and Martin Luther King. And we have the support of our community to do this work together. I'm going to leave you with, I'm going to give Nazim Hikmet the last word here. He says, this is the end to his poem, Some Advice to Those Who Will Serve Time in Prison, which is really all of us. He says, I mean, it's not that you can't pass 10 or 15 years inside, or even more. You can, as long as the jewel in the left side of your chest doesn't lose its luster. Thank you.